Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host Chris, alongside my co-host Dean, and for today's show, we're going to be talking about the murder of Bridget Cleary and a case of superstition gone wrong. How you doing today, buddy?
Oh, I'm good. You caught me off guard. You usually do the whole intro about like if you're a listener and you want to be on a guest or whatever. Like I was you caught me off guard. I was like doing some research and then you're like, hey, what's going on, man? I'm like, oh shit. I'm good. How about you?
I'm good. I put that in our outro now.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Yeah.
Nice.
Just piloting something new and see how it goes.
Keep it fresh.
If I need to, I can, bring back the spiel in the beginning.
Nice.
But today's topic, actually, before we talk about today's topic, we took like a couple week hiatus just to recharge the good old brain. And, because this, even though we do this once a week, it's kind of exhausting going back to the well time and time again, even though we have a plethora of topics to talk about. But I feel recharged and ready for this one. How about yourself?
Yeah, I have to say, I didn't realize, we just hit 50 episodes and I think we do need to reset from time to time because a lot of the stuff we talk about on a weekly basis and we do research on it, it's heavy stuff. And like, we're trying not to just talk out of our asses. We're trying to like have enough understanding and knowledge about the thing we're talking about to riff off of it at least. So that it's really difficult to do research on, especially stories where it's like, murders and suicide and just like really dark things. And it's just good to, I feel recharged as well. And I think I'm ready to go for another 50 episodes. Let's do it.
Absolutely. That's a goal for this year. Try to hit episode 100 at least.
Inundate the people with shit.
But no, you're right about that, man. The whole research stuff. How long did we prepare for that H.H. Holmes episode? We talked about it for at least a month before we even decided to record it because there was just so much information. So, yeah, you're right about that. But I want to shift gears to the unfortunate case of Mrs. Bridget Cleary.
Mm-hmm.
And our listeners, if you listen to episode 50, our guest Trev mentioned Bridget Cleary and how she was essentially murdered because her husband thought she was a changeling or a fairy. So why don't you kick us off, buddy? What do you got for us?
A lot of the information that I've come across, I've looked into several sources to kind of like get a good foundation, and some of them are different. I don't think we haven't really seen that when we've done research. A lot of the different sources tend to match up pretty tightly, but this one has somewhat of a range of like dates and accounts and just sub stories about the actual event. But just generally speaking, I guess it's good to start with the time frame. So we're talking about a time in which this is not long after the Great Famine in Ireland that happened in 1845 to 1849. And not long after that, that is when little Bridget was born. And I apologize, I can't remember off the top of my head. I forgot to write down her maiden name. She was born in or around, based on my research, she was born in or around 1868 or 1869, I believe. I think she had some siblings. She wasn't the first child for sure, but you got to imagine like back then being an infant in a working class home in Ireland right after the Great Famine. You're talking about like rags, bad nutrition. However, a little spot of light in this story is that her father had enough wherewithal and hope for his family that he tried to get her access to really great education, which he did. He managed to get her into Catholic school at a young age, and she was taught whatever professional or whatever category of mannerism and etiquette in society and stuff, which apparently was really important back then. You needed to have that on your credentials and some kind of understanding on which side of the plate the fork goes on, so to speak, in order to impress others and take another step up in life. So after that, she found out she had a knack for dressmaking, and she ended up being one of the prime breadwinners for her family at a young age because she learned how to make dresses and clothing, and she actually became an apprentice which that's actually kind of interesting to me in a nutshell, because you always hear about like men getting apprenticeships back in the day, and it always has like an apprenticeship of like building something or maybe even farming or whatever. But I've never heard before today like of an apprenticeship for a dressmaker. It's just, that's really interesting to me. I'd always love to like be a nerd and dig into the dynamics of that. But I'll switch it back over to you to keep telling the story and to get to the juicy parts. And before I think actually before we push it any further, you, Mr. Historian, maybe we can talk a little bit about the dynamics of Ireland in the 1860s, because we do know that some things were going on in the world that probably would have made news in or around Ireland, because we're not talking about like the middle of the ancient days of no news spread. So we did have the Civil War raging in America at that time, or at least wrapping up not long after that. And that was probably on the minds of people. What do you know, though, about the Great Potato? Was it the Great Potato Famine? Is that another name for it? Do you know anything about that?
I think it's called the Great Famine now.
Just the Great Famine. Okay, yeah. Being more sensitive about trying to disassociate Guinness
Ireland
and potatoes and leprechauns and like, okay, that's how woke of you. Oh, don't say that. Some people are gonna hate that term. Okay, we're not woke. We're woke, but we're not woke. Okay, we'll straddle both sides.
Informed of you.
Hey, there you go. Brilliant.
Yeah. So essentially, there was economic problems because, how do I put it? Certain like social and political and economic problems led to issues with farms, and I'm not really well versed on 18th, 19th century Ireland. So essentially what I know from that time period is that it got to a point where farms became so small that they could only grow potatoes. And over a couple years before you had the Great Famine, from my understanding, was that they had really bad harvests. And potatoes were kind of one of the main crops that fed everyone. If you don't have a good harvest, you're not going to eat. So that happening twice in a row, according to some accounts, that's, what'll cause it. And at the time of Bridget was alive, you had the whole thing of, you had a party that was like for self-governance. The Irish people should govern themselves. They shouldn't be part of the crown, yada, yada. So you had all that political stuff going on. And also you mentioned the American Civil War, which you did have a large number of Irish men signing up to fight for both the Union and the Confederacy.
Holy shit. I did not know. I never knew that. That's interesting.
Yeah. There were Irish folks that fought for the Confederacy, but more so you had more people fighting for the Union, hence the Irish Brigade. If you ever watched the movie Gods and Generals, the Battle of Fredericksburg, they portray that battle like really very well. The Irish Brigade.
What's the reason for the Irish Brigade? Like, or why did the Irish want to fight over here? Did they have family? Is it because they had family over here, or do you know the reason why?
Well, if you think about the time period, you had a lot of people immigrating to the United States. And for those of you that are not familiar with American history, Americans that were here, like with the formation of the United States, descendants of the colonists, they didn't like foreigners. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. If you look up historical photos, they would have pictures of signs in shops saying hiring, and it would say Italians and Irish need not apply.
Oh, yeah.
Outright discrimination. Yeah, it's interwoven into our history, unfortunately. I'll digress from that. So more so, it's like, okay, there's a war going on. We need money. Most immigrants coming in are poor. They don't have anything. So they need money. And it was a way to they thought they would find acceptance among Americans. And also, you can't forget the fact that there was also talks that the British would step in support of the Confederate States. And most Irish did not like the crown. So
that makes perfect sense. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So that's another reason. So it's not like just one sole reason that there was the rumor that the British crown was going to back the Confederacy, because that's where the British got like their textiles and cotton from for cheap. It was because immigrants coming to a new place, they need money. What better way than to try to ingrain yourself or get the people to like you than fighting for their country?
Yeah, very strategic. And can I just say real quick, this is fascinating to me. Like, you brought up those signs that used to be around, and I've seen those mostly in like comedies where they're like referencing like such and such subgenre or subsect of society need not apply. But those were real signs that, you know, we know existed back then. Like the Irish need not apply, the Italian need not apply. But the reason why I'm bringing it up really quickly is because it's such a crazy concept that the way it was worded, it's almost like an adult talking to a child. So it's not outright derogatory and saying it to somebody and just like, you know, like, you are less than us, don't come anywhere near us. It's not malicious. It's kind of just like it's malicious, but like covered malicious by saying like, yeah, you don't really need to apply. Okay. It's kind of it's like softer. And that's just really fascinating to me that you don't have people. I mean, you have people out there who were like probably beating the shit out of Irish people and Italian people back then, like gangs and stuff who were beating each other up or
Watch
beating
Gangs
them up.
of New York.
Yeah,
Watch
targeting
Gangs of
them
New
and stuff.
York.
Yeah, I remember that was a good movie. But like,
Pug
it's just
Uglies.
fascinating that yeah, it's almost like it's like the same thing as like, you know, I don't know. I feel like African Americans had way more malicious things pointed at them. But I could be wrong.
Oh,
But just to, like,
absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, the whole point of the war, sorry people, was to free them from bondage.
you
Like,
mean it wasn't the cotton trade, or it wasn't the trade in South in the
part of it. But
yeah.
real quick, 7 Union generals were Irish born, and there was
Wow.
an estimated 150,000 Irish Americans that fought in the war.
Mm-hmm.
And in our backyard over in Pennsylvania, the Irish Brigade held a Catholic mass before they faced Pickett's charge.
Wow.
And
Interesting.
they whooped their asses. They had Jesus
Yeah.
on their side.
They had They had the Jesus crackers in their belly, and that gave them enough energy.
Yeah.
Okay, so okay, we'll tie. Sorry everyone, we went off on a historical tangent. Hopefully you found that at least mildly interesting. But the reason why we brought all of this historical perspective up is because it really frames the time in which we're talking about in Ireland. So you have a lot of heavy things circulating within society within the time that Bridget was born and grown up in. She essentially was in the society where a lot of death, a lot of a reverberation from starvation, that like people were still alive who remembered that very clearly. And there was also, it didn't seem like there was so much subjugation from a gender standpoint. There probably was a little bit, but I think it seems more likely that it was a class subjugation thing, and she grew up in a lower class family. But there was some hope there because she got some education and she started pulling herself out and her family out of poverty. Those things were still very much a real possibility to get dragged back down into. And most importantly, we're going to talk about this in more detail later, but the spiritual and the mystical side of Ireland was also amplified by these very real existential struggles. So you have people talking about fairies and blaming fairies for terrible things that happen, things that go missing. But actually, I found out doing my research, I found this personally fascinating, that people actually left offerings for fairies. Like, they would put food out on the table and they would say prayers like bless the fairies or something like that. So it wasn't, you know, when we talked to like the last podcast, it was basically like, you know, it was framed like fairies were evil, which, you know, I think some people believe they are evil and like deep down, but it does sound like they do have some kind of, for lack of a better term, humanity, where they are appeasable. They do want to have some exposure to the human side of life, or interactions with humans. So it's not all just like kill all humans, you know, robot fairy sort of thing. I don't know. Do you have any other extra perspectives to add on that before we march forward on the story of Bridget? I think the perspective is interesting in and of itself, but I don't want to make it too boring.
No, I think you brought some good points about fairies. And on our previous pod on episode 50, when we talked to Trev, who's from Ireland, if you didn't listen to it, Kind of sounds like Colin Farrell, as you say. He even said that, to quote him, that fairies are gnarly bastards. Like you don't mess with fairies. Even though your example of the New York construction crew that fucked the fairies, but
asterisks, mystical fairies.
That still makes me chuckle. But yeah, you can see like in this case in general of how that superstition was in so deep, and you're talking about the late 1800s going into the 20th century with like all the modernizations and everything like that. And I'm pretty sure like at the time for certain countries the Industrial Revolution either already happened or was still going on. But again, like Trev said, that some parts of Ireland were very, very rural. And in this case, it sounds like this was the case. And a lot of those old traditions still held a lot of sway. So that all of that coming together to me brings us to this unfortunate case of what happened to Bridget. But one thing that I wanted to talk about real quick was you mentioned that she was well educated, which she was. She became an apprentice. She became a dressmaker. She had one of those like Singer sewing machines, which were probably not cheap back then.
Yeah.
So she was doing that. She had her like own flock of chickens. She was selling eggs. So she had a really nice flow of income.
She was an influencer back in the day.
She was an influencer back in the day.
Their version of influencing was having chickens and making dresses and just being a trifecta, like a full force independent woman. That was how they made a lot of progress back then, just like people make progress today with YouTube and podcasts. Yeah. We got our chickens.
Right then in 1887, Bridget marries Michael Cleary, who was a cooper. I can't remember what a cooper is. You remember what a cooper is?
Yeah, I think they made barrels. Like they made like cask barrels or whatever. Like they were able to shape them and put the metal around them, and it was like a specialized skill.
Yeah. And what's interesting about their marriage, which I watched multiple documentaries on them, and one thing one of the documentaries said was that they didn't live together.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah,
and also the age difference. They got married. It wasn't the age difference that was odd. It was the fact that she got married at 18, and she was actually very popular. Apparently, she was very beautiful, and the fact that she was well educated and had some money, she had a lot of gentleman callers at a young age. But the fact that she honed in on Michael Cleary, and they ended up getting married when she was 18 and he was 26. Again, apparently, and I'm sorry, everybody. Like I'm nerding out today because I don't know why I have such a sharp interest in the historical narrative of this story, but it's like anytime I hear a story about a culture that has strong, independent women who are respected in society, it just seems so counter to the rest of human history. It's almost like when you go back to like ancient Egypt and like you think like the women were like you have Cleopatra and stuff like that, and female leadership, but like the fact that she was very popular, had everything going for her, yet she's still married at the age of 18, which was, that's insanely young even for back then. It's almost like, she's being locked down, so to speak, at a young age. So she's kind of like closing off any opportunities beyond that or outside of marriage. I wonder, like in the documentary, I think I heard them say that women married quote unquote a lot later in life, but I don't know what that means.
Yeah,
it 10 years later, like 28, 30, or
if I had to assume, I would probably say mid-20s. Probably mid-20s, late 20s.
Yeah.
Is when they would.
Doesn't sound like she was very encourageable, right? She seemed like she had a very straight head on and, wasn't really up in the clouds that much. So, but the fact that Michael Cleary was 26, it seems like based off of what you're saying, he was probably around the age that a lot of people get married or got married in Ireland around that time. So he, I guess, the age difference isn't too crazy, but if you're talking about back then, he probably had a lot more life experience than she did, even though she had a level head on about her and did experience some success. But the reason why we're talking about this is not to just, blather on. It's kind of like trying to pick apart and understand the dynamic that they had. Because like you said, they didn't live together, and that actually created some gossip in and around the local population, which I imagine was, weighing down on, like, imagine you're 18 years old, you just got married, and you and your husband are living in a small town, but you live in different houses. Like maybe you live with your parents and he lives in an apartment across town, and all of your friends are like, what? Why are they just got married? Why are they doing that? That's kind of weird. Is it kind of like a quid pro quo thing, like a tax thing or something? But that must have created some strain and pressure on them that stayed with them for years.
I would say so. And also, with that being the case, like rumors start to spread.
Mm-hmm.
So like that is one thing that can't be helped, because people love to gossip. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if, they're like, oh, well, they don't live together. Like, what's going on here? Like, is she having an affair when she like goes off and does her own thing? And like that would be the first thing that they say. But
apparently
I found this dynamic to be weird. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's cool, man. Yeah, I guess time marched on though. Nonetheless, they got through all the rumors and stuff like that unscathed, and they kept doing the things that they were doing, and they made some money, and they were eventually able to save up for a brand new cottage, and that's the one that they moved into to kind of start their second chapter in their life. And I think Bridget was like 26 or 27. What is that? 8 years later, so he would have been like 33-ish around there. So that is quite a bit of time. And I guess like when you're getting into your 30s, in and around that age, that time period, you're probably hitting like middle age. However, they were successful and they were still chugging away and making money. Of course, an unfortunate event. Bridget apparently took a turn for the worse when she fell very ill, and that's where this is the linchpin where the story starts to get interesting, and we could start talking about the creepy events and the mystical side of everything that the people believed about what was going on with her. Do you want to lead us in? Why don't you lead us into that part of the conversation? Like, so she fell ill. I think one of the documentaries said that she claimed that she had walked past a fairy ring or something like that, or like a fairy in some place. Fairy fort, yeah, like where people believe that fairies were hanging out. That's probably something we should talk about really quickly to kind of set the stage and the dynamic. So like we did mention in the beginning that Ireland still very much believed in like the fairy world and all that stuff, and they actually recognize spots in and around places they live, like maybe it's an old tree, maybe it's an old fort or a hole in the ground or something, and then people just as a collective decide that's where the fairies are. That's where fairies are. Better stay away from it. So a lot of people believed that those things were real. So can you imagine, like she walked past something and she suddenly fell ill, or she felt like she suddenly fell ill and it got worse really quickly. People would put two and two together back then and be like, oh shit, it must be the fairies because she was literally right next to that old fort when she got sick. Can you imagine though how different the story might have played out if she just like got sick one morning? Like she didn't say anything about going near any fairy ring or something like that, and she just got randomly sick. I wonder if things would have played out differently.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think of that aspect of it. But yeah, so she said the claim is that she went out for a walk. She walked by this fairy fort or fairy ring by her home, and then she got sick, really sick, to the point where she was, I think one of the documentaries said that she was shivering uncontrollably to the point they put her near the fireplace, like covered her in blankets and laid her near like a blazing fire in the fireplace. Nothing would work. She was just really sick. And then they call on a doctor who came by and prescribed some medicine. It got so bad to the point that like her husband went to go get a doctor. and they called on the doctor, and he prescribed her some medicine. I forget what they prescribed her. Do you recall before they got into the whole superstition stuff?
I can't remember, but what did they say she had again? He thought she had bronchitis or something like that, or
It was some sort of like overexertion or something like that. They said it was something really, really like weird. And they're like, oh, it'll pass in a few days.
Yeah. But I want to mention that really quickly, actually, is imagine, back then, I imagine people didn't have the best nutrition. And one thing I forgot to mention this earlier on, but one thing that's always important to highlight, and I swear this is not a crack at Irish, this is just a crack at like, the people who existed, generally speaking, in the old days, they would drink, especially the poorer people, they would drink things like beer and stuff because water wasn't as accessible. It wasn't very potable. And you could get really sick from drinking water. What people did, I'm sure a lot of people already know this, but what people did back then was they would drink low alcohol content beer or mead or whatever, something that would guarantee there would be enough alcohol to kill off any bacteria in the liquid they drank. So they still got nutrition from it. So that's the time period that we're talking about, right? So like people were not really nourished very well. They probably had access to decent nutrition here and there, but imagine you're a woman and you're walking every day. You're probably dead exhausted most of the time. And maybe you didn't eat right for the last week or something like that. And then you get sick. Like you get sick with bronchitis or something today that would like knock us on our ass, but not necessarily kill us. But back then, if you had poor nutrition, even if you were in your like late 20s, early 30s, it's going to give you a run for your money. And I would wonder, I would probably venture a guess that that's one of the reasons why she had uncontrollable shaking, was because she was probably malnourished in addition to having this ailment. And for whatever reason, like a doctor just didn't recognize that, like, oh, maybe give her some soup or something with meat in it, or, something like that. But they didn't do that. They gave her medicine, which some sources say that Michael Cleary, the husband, gave to her. Other sources say that he actually poured it down the drain and tried to give her some other concoction. But that's the next part of the story, isn't it? Why don't you talk about part of the story with the doctor coming, and then they actually tried a different kind of doctor, a less reputable kind of doctor.
Yeah. Before I go into the fairy doctor, I wanted to track back a little bit. So she was sick for several days. It was more than a week later that she was seen by a physician. She was diagnosed with, you were correct, it was bronchitis. She was in such bad shape that a priest came to administer last rites.
Oh, shit.
Her friends and family members attended to her over the following 2 days. They tried home remedies, and that's where we get into the whole fairy stuff. I think, I can't recall, I might be getting ahead of myself, but I think they tried to get her to do communion, and she wasn't able to eat the communion wafer or whatever they had at the time for that. I don't know if it's changed over the years. It probably has. But they accused her of being a fairy. And when I say they accused her of being a fairy or a changeling, they were of the impression that she was taken when she walked by that fairy fort, and that a fairy was sent in her place to pretend to be Bridget. Because, like we talked about with Trev on the Irish pod, that they'll send a changeling or a fairy to take the place of a human for a better life, essentially. And the belief is that if you kill the fairy or you drive away the fairy, that will bring the person back. So on March 15th of 1895, Michael Cleary, influenced by his belief in changelings, seeks the help of a local fairy doctor named Dennis Gainey to cure Bridget. The rituals involved herbs, potions that were essentially to expel the perceived changeling or fairy. We'll just call him changeling moving forward. On that same day, a group of people, including Michael Cleary, participates in a ritual that was meant to force the changeling out of Bridget. The ceremony involved forcing her to consume herbs and dousing her with urine. Some of the documentaries, I don't know if you recall, say that they actually try to make her drink it.
Oh man, drinking urine? Probably should have just given her Guinness. Oh, shots fired. No, sorry,
Dude,
that's
I
really
like
dark.
Guinness.
I know, I do too. I do too. Fuck you. I love Guinness. No,
It goes good
too,
with brunch food.
It does. That was too dark of a shot because apparently I'm gonna take a wild guess and say that she really did get some pee doused on her, which is really terrible. So here's the thing though that I find fascinating about this part of the story. So, and kind of funny. I got to make one more joke. I'm sorry. That's going to sound so stupid, but the fairy doctor, talk about the fairy doctor. I kind of think of like a Mel Brooks skit where it's like the guy, like Michael Cleary's walking around. He's just all despondent. He's like, oh God, I need to figure out what's going on. I think it's a fairy, but and he's just like muttering to himself. And he's just like, oh, I need a doctor. I need a doctor who will actually come. And then like he says it out loud. And then like the guy next to him is like, oh, I'm a doctor. How much will you pay me? And then he's like, no, I don't need a doctor. It's fairies. I need a fairy. And then he's like, oh, I know about fairies. Oh man, if only there was a way. And the guy's just like, I can help you. I'm a doctor, but I'm a fairy doctor. And then the guy's like, you're hired. And then he just goes and like throws pee on her. Like, oh, we just got to pee in a cup and throw it on her and she'll be fine. And then like, that's just there's some kind of skit. There's some kind of comedy skit there.
That stupid skit like that. Yes.
But again, real life story, real terrible events. So it's too dark to actually do it, but it's kind of funny, but it's kind of not. Anyway. Okay. So the fairy doctor, the real life fairy doctor, which I'm sure was a real thing, probably still is a real thing, kind of like a medicine man sort of thing going on. I guess they had, like you said, they chanted things over her. They tried all kinds of, they tried to force milk down her throat, which I did not know until today when I did research that apparently there's a belief that changelings or fairies really love milk. I didn't know that. Fairies love milk apparently, which I guess I'm a fairy.
Why would you feed her it?
That doesn't make sense, right? Like I don't know. Like it's some kind of concoction or I guess it's just all specious reasoning. It's like, oh, we need to do this and that. Like, yeah, maybe like to throw her like the fairy off or something. But they tried all sorts of things and nothing seemed to work until she actually had, I think, what was kind of like a fever break or a breakthrough, because apparently at one point she pulled through it just enough to be able to get out of bed, put some normal clothes on, but she was still emaciated. She still didn't look herself. And then she still caught those accusations about her not being herself because of how she looked and how she was acting. And think about it. I mean, for God's sake, if you are sitting there and you've been sick for a week and you're emaciated, you're starving, you can't keep things down, you're probably muttering to yourself. Like I remember there was like times in my life where, like you're really sick. You got like the worst flu, maybe even like COVID, but you're laying in your bed and you're trying to get some sleep and you just hit this point where you're just muttering to yourself like, oh, I just want to get fucking better. Oh my God. Oh, it just sucks so bad. I'm so sick. Oh. And you're just talking to yourself like that, hoping you get better. Just imagine like it was probably 10 times worse back then. So they probably thought she was just, completely possessed or the changeling that they believe she was. So she was dealing with that. But then she gets up, she's having somewhat of a breakthrough. And then the worst of the worst happens. She says something to trigger her husband, Michael Cleary. One documentary made a claim that she said something along the lines of like, oh, your mother followed the fairies, and just because she followed the fairies, you think that I'm going to follow the fairies or something like that. And I guess that's kind of like throwing shade back then, pissed off Michael Cleary enough to accuse I guess I would guess that's when he made up his mind. It's like, this is a motherfucking fairy and this fairy is making fun of me and I need to get my wife back. So what happened next?
Yeah. And to continue off of what you were saying, so I watched a few documentaries on YouTube about this, and one of them said that he questioned her, asking, "Are you my wife? Are you my wife?" And she would like answer, "Yes, yes." And on the third time the question came around, she wouldn't answer. They asked her, I think they asked her 3 times, "Are you a fairy?" She'd say, "No." "Are you a fairy?" "No." And then the third time around, for some reason, she wouldn't answer. And that's things like that just kind of reinforced their superstition that, okay, I see, I could see behind your tricks, fairy.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to fool me.
Lucky number
And-
3, and you won't answer on the third time. I could see
you won't
why
answer on
someone
the
would
third time. And
come
they
to
tried
that.
to do like a holy like communion for her, and she wasn't able to swallow down the communion bread or wafer.
Mm.
Like, I think she like either couldn't swallow it or she did and like threw it up. And they're like, oh, a fairy like wouldn't be able to ingest a holy object like that. Well, considering the fact that it probably tastes really bad, and second, she was probably in a state where medically she couldn't ingest anything because she would probably just throw it up.
Yeah.
So all of that comes together to the point where, in a fit of hysteria, he like goes nuts. He's like, she's a fairy, and he's convinced in himself that the real Bridget is dead, and
Or no, he has to free her. He has to free her.
Oh,
that's the
right,
story.
Yes,
Yeah.
So I've seen a couple of different ones.
Oh, okay.
One where he thinks that she's dead, and he wants to kill the changeling or the fairy as payback. And another one that says that if they kill the fairy, it'll bring her back. One of the documentaries said that she'd come back riding to them on like some sort of gray horse or something like that.
Yeah, I heard white horse,
shit.
but yeah, something like that. But yeah, go ahead, man. Sorry, you want to tell?
No, go ahead. You want to tell us what? Go ahead and tell us what happens.
Okay. All right. So I'll be the the terrible part of the story, the worst part of the story. There's 2 versions that I came across, and I'm hoping it's going to be the one I'm going to talk about right now, but it's probably like, knowing life, it's the latter. So the first story is that she, in this fit of rage by her husband, he pushed her or she fell or something, hit her head. She was unconscious. And he just decided in that moment to douse her in some kind of oil and light her on fire, which he did, because that's how he murdered his wife. However, the even worse story is that, like I said earlier, she said some snark comment to him about, his mother following the fairies, and she he was blaming her too or something like that. And then he just got pissed off. In either story, he still douses her in some kind of lamp oil or something, gets the fire poker out of the fire, and then touches it to her. I guess she was only wearing like the innermost layer of clothing that they had back then, which I didn't know this was called like a chemise or something. It's kind of like a nightie for women or something like that. So that's actually interesting to me real quick. And it's very terrible to talk about, I know, but I would think that if you had very, very silky, small, like light clothing on, and you were doused with oil, I guess if the oil got into your skin and soaked in, like, you would still suffer terrible burns. But I would guess that if you died from being lit on fire like she did, you would have to be covered in a lot more clothing in order to do so. But maybe the oil helped that. But I'm getting a little bit too dark and deep for this. So essentially what happened was he lit his wife on fire in the hopes that he would either, like you said, he'd either get payback, or if it was the other part of the story, he would actually get his wife back by killing the fairy, the changeling, and setting his real wife free from the fairy world or the fairy realm nearby, and then she would come back to him. But I can't imagine that he must have had something going on with him. Like, it must have been like a psychological break from the stressors of life, or maybe he had one too many drinks. I surprisingly never came across anything that suggested he was an alcoholic. But when I hear a story like this, I always think about that. I was like, this guy, he lost a source of income. His wife can't work. They have this new house, which is presumably they didn't buy outright. They probably have some kind of mortgage on it or something. And they're probably going to lose the house because she's sick. And then that pressure makes him like drink a lot. Maybe he drank a lot, drank too much, and then really leaned into this fairy idea. And he's like, this is the last ditch hope for me to get my real wife back, so we can actually get back to, like, put things back the way they were. He sets her on fire. She dies. And then unfortunately, she never comes back in that moment. So what what's the next step? What happens? He apparently had somebody there who was a family member. He threatened the family member, I think it was like a cousin or something, to help him go take the body and bury it out in the woods, which he did. And then 3 days later, I guess under guilt or grief or something, he confessed to a priest, and the priest went on to tell the local law enforcement. And then why don't you pick it up from there? We'll close it out. Close that story out.
Yeah. So the case gets attention. He gets arrested and is charged with murder. The reason the case gets significant attention because it highlights the intersection of superstition and violence in rural Ireland. So they go to trial, and I believe he is convicted of manslaughter instead of murder. Some say that he was sentenced to prison or 15 years of prison, and some say that he was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. And I believe the other folks that were involved were charged in some form or fashion, but not as bad as he was. At the end of the day, he serves time for the murder, but I think when he actually finishes his sentence, he escapes. Not escape, but he immigrates to Canada, and he kind of just disappears from history at that point.
Yeah, you can find pictures of him actually. Yeah, if you Google his, you can find. Which that's also interesting to me. It's I wonder why those pictures were taken, because some of them are mugshots, obviously, but I don't know if all of them are mugshots. I think there's at least one picture of the actual Bridget woman that you can find. And I guess, that was a time period, even though they were working class, that was a time period where photographs were becoming more prevalent and you could go get your picture taken more easily. Maybe it was more readily available even up in rural Ireland. But there are pictures of them. And it is true that when he got out 15 to 20 years later, he did immigrate to Canada. And we don't really know. I think if you really did some digging, you could probably find out, maybe he changed his name and then, track him that way and see what he did for the rest of his life. But I don't imagine he lived much longer because he would have been probably in his early to mid 50s, if not getting up to the late 50s. And that would have been in that would have been right before World War I when shit hit the fan globally. So 1909, 1910 when he emigrated over. And then 8 years later or 5 years later, you have World War I. He essentially disappeared, like you said, from the limelight. No one really knows what he did afterwards. But if you go back a little bit and think about the characteristic of the trial, that's another piece of the story that I think is important to highlight. He could have easily been tried, probably would have been tried in other parts of the world as murder, and he would have been sentenced to death or life in prison or whatever. However, they decided and this really emphasizes what we were saying earlier in the conversation about the beliefs and the mystical structure of Ireland back then, because the jury, the judge, or whoever presided over the case decided that he really did believe in these things. And that was grounds for him to not be tried for murder, instead to be tried for manslaughter. Now, if you flip that on its head and imagine you have a similar case today, which I'm sure there are all kinds of cases like that today. And I want to talk about that before we close out today. Maybe we can kind of talk about the history of changelings and different cultural perspectives and even in popular culture. It actually is a really creepy concept. But imagine today, if someone had the same story, I thought my loved one was changed out with a devil or a demon or something, and then they killed them. That person would probably be sent to if they were believed, that person would be evaluated psychologically. And if they were found to have psychological issues or beliefs like that, they would be sent to a mental institution or whatever the proper term is nowadays. They probably wouldn't be jailed, because you don't just throw someone with mental illness in a jail. So I just think that's really an interesting concept of the story.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's where you get me with the superstition stuff, in the sense that it's crazy that he could use that as a defense. But when you understand the context of the time and the beliefs of people around them, 200 years prior to that, you had people thinking that witches were were going in the forest in New England and signing deals with the devil and all that stuff. So I don't know, dude. I think if this happened in the United States, or if this happened in England or another place that was a little more industrial, or even if it like happened in like a major city in Ireland, I think it would have probably went differently, in which he would have been convicted of murder. He probably would have been executed. But one angle that I wanted to take, that I waited to bring this up, is if we take into context of who Bridget was, she was highly educated. She made dresses. She had her own sewing machine. She sold eggs. She had all of these streams of income, and she was highly intelligent, highly independent, and can make her own money. I'm here thinking that he probably didn't like that. That was probably a point of contention in their marriage, maybe, given the time period of the dynamic between men and women at the time. And that could have been a motive of, well, I'm over here making barrels, but she's like selling eggs and she's making dresses and making all this money. So she was probably making more money than him. So he probably didn't take that very well and found a reason to potentially get rid of her. Not potentially get rid of her. He fucking got rid of her. And if you think about it,
I can see that. Oh, sorry.
If you think about it, he kind of got away with it too, because he did his time and then he was able to live out the rest of his life. So that's an angle I wanted to bring up. What are your thoughts on that?
I can totally, I can see that side of the story. I could see that it was a jealousy factor. However, there is one minor point that we forgot to bring up that could kind of flip that on its head. Apparently, there is a story floating around that after he burnt his wife to death, he went on top of a hill or something like that and sat there for like 2 days or something, or just like he was essentially either going up to the hill every day or sitting there for a number of days waiting and expecting for his wife to come back. So anyone who actually killed their wife out of spite or whatever, I don't think he was smart enough to like try to do that to hide the fact that he did it on purpose. I think that would be a pretty big leap. So I would probably lean more towards the camp that he really did believe. Whether, maybe there was some stress and anxiety about her and the culture and the time and her independence and the money making. There's probably some of that churning around in terms of resentment and hatred and mistrust. But I would venture to guess that he had some kind of borderline psychological issues. And this actually we could flip this back really quickly. There's a story that we covered not long ago about the Wendigo. And if you want to give that a listen, I think that was a pretty decent podcast episode we did a few episodes, or I don't even know how, it was quite a while ago, I guess. But anyway, we talked about this one guy who apparently killed and ate his family, or at least his children. Can't exactly remember if I think he killed his whole family, but he was brought to trial and he was put to death. But we did kind of posit the idea that, he might have actually believed that his family, or he was possessed by a Wendigo, and that he actually had to eat and consume his family. And that kind of like is in a similar vein of the story that we're talking about now.
Yeah, and that was episode 30. Titled
Episode 30.
Wendigo,
Okay.
Skinwalkers, Cannibalism, and Black Magic. So yeah, we did talk about a similar case. And one thing I wanted to bring up before we close out for today was the death of Michael Leahy that happened in 1826. It's really sad. He was 4 years old. He died by drowning, and he was killed by Anne Roche.
His grandmother, right?
I think so. Yeah. Claimed to be able to heal. So the community thought because he couldn't speak or stand that there was some fairy magic at work or something involved with that. And she thought that drowning him would drive the fairy out. So there's another case in 1826 in the 19th century. And you want to know the crazy part? That I'm not surprised. A jury acquitted her of murder. So here you have a 4-year-old that's probably has some sort of mental issue, has some sort of cognitive issues, And the superstition runs wild that they think, it's a fairy, so they go and murder him.
The more I hear stories like this, the more I think I get older, I am able to kind of envision what the psychological narrative is being played out in the minds of these people who think this. And I don't think it's as simple as they just believe that this person is possessed or they're switched out with a changeling or whatever. I would have to say, I think what's going on is they are just so overburdened and tired of life in general. And I've seen it in people in and around my lives, especially like the older generations, which is understandable. I mean, you're getting older, you have this woman who's a grandmother, you're becoming less relevant in society in terms of like production and worth, you're being seen as being worth less and less as you get older. And you're probably not living your best life because you're living in 1820s Ireland, which, as we all know was no cakewalk. So all of those stressors, and you also have the factor of uneducated, like you were saying, like they probably didn't even have a word for schizophrenia or a word for whatever psychological issue or mental issue or whatever the proper term is nowadays for that little boy. I would think that like the suppressed anger and frustration of having a child that's like that and not having any avenue or any way to express it and having a general feeling of hopelessness, I think all of those are swirling around and they just happen to be wrapped up in this lore of a changeling or something mystical happening or something. But really is what's going on is you're just losing your shit and you're desperate and you're holding on to any kind of explanation you can. And the only explanation is leading you down the path of how do I undo this terrible thing that's happening to me? And we've seen this in other cultures. It's not just, these particular Irish cases. We've seen similar cases in, South America. And we've seen similar cases in China and stuff, especially with like the little girls who were born during the time period where it was a one child policy. And, the little girls couldn't give heirs or whatever, or help the elderly or the parents older on, like, as they aged or whatever. So they would kill the little girls or give them up for adoption. And then they would try to have a little boy. So it's just stuff like that. Like the psychological pressure of society, I think really contributes a lot to it. The last thing we could talk about that might be interesting to the listeners is the concept of changelings in general. It is a terrifying concept, and we have it in different cultures and genres of popular culture where like it's not just fairies, it's also like aliens, like body snatchers. Now we have AI and robots and like like being replaced. It's like this concept that the person you love is being replaced by something that's not that person, and they're tricking you in some way that's either going to end in your death or your abuse or taking advantage of you somehow, and you're not going to see your true loved one again. And I think that the psychological stress of that possibility is really, really significant. Like imagine you have someone in your life, like your wife or like my wife or whatever, or my daughter, like thinking about that she could be switched out or they could be switched out and I could not tell the difference. That would be terrifying. That's a terrifying, horrible, horrible concept. Like, why would you ever think about that? But it's a real thing that floats around in our society, and it's just a creepy story.
No, I completely agree with you. And the whole concept of a changeling is just not, like you said, it's not just in Ireland. It's obviously all over places in Europe, but even in some parts of Africa. The Igbo people of eastern Nigeria believed that women who lost numerous children, whether stillborn or early in infancy, were being tormented by, I'm going to butcher this, an ogbanje, a malicious spirit that reincarnated itself over and over. So here we are, like there are different variations of it. And the Igbo themselves often translate the word into English as changeling.
Wow, that's creepy.
Yeah. So it's all over the place, man. And obviously the superstition comes along with people when they immigrate to the United States. So that's where you find the concept here as well. So it makes you think, was there at one point some sort of creature thousands of years ago that is now extinct that could potentially do that? Or is it a remnant of some sort of ancient predator that is instilled in our DNA to be afraid of. Like, who knows? A predator that was able to mimic like human noises or something like that, like thousands of years ago, that science probably haven't found the fossils of.
Yeah. Or maybe just like a parrot.
Right. Yes.
Motherfucker!
Parrot.
I stole your kid. I stole your kid. So changelings, I think that your latter explanation is more likely. I think it's, it's humans just explaining very terrible things in a manner that is mystical or magical. Because if you really think about what would have to be required for a changeling to actually, like a fairy to do something, to be a changeling, how do they, even if they could like completely take on your form, which means all of your blood and organs and brain and all that stuff, they would still have to have your memories, at least to a certain degree, to remember where things are around your house. They would have to have like understanding of the linguistics, the language, like all of those things would have to be necessary. So at what point would you say that the fairy would cease to be the fairy and just be the person they're replacing? And that would be useless. You would just be the person. You know what I mean? The only way I could see this working out is if in the future we have advanced, like, say, Westworld level robotics where you cannot outwardly distinguish a person from an android or a robot, and they can mimic or somehow ingest the knowledge of that person, but still be able to take orders from somebody else and try to trick the people who love them. And maybe we'll go through this whole shit again with changelings in 100 years when androids do become a real thing. Have you seen like videos, like people like go out there and Google videos of androids or animatronics or whatever? People are making some crazy realistic human-like robots that are moving their lips and their eyes and their ears and their mouth in a way that just looks so unbelievably realistic. I would really be surprised. Yeah, no, not that, man. I'm not talking about that nasty shit. The real doll thing. What was that one thing? I think it was like The Simpsons or it was South Park or Family Guy or something where they're like, yes, in the year 2050, every man in the world will have 10 real dolls, and they will all do the most crazy sexual things that they could ever want the person to do. If you don't know what a real doll is, don't look it up. It's essentially a life-size sex toy that looks like a person.
Yeah, don't look it up as you fucking explain it.
Don't. Well, my explanation is better than Googling it and seeing a giant anime-chested doll or whatever.
Okay, we gotta stop you.
Okay, let's stop. We're digging ourselves into a hole. A fairy hole.
A fairy hole, yeah. Folks, don't go looking for fairies. Don't go fucking around with fairy forts or looking for changelings.
Or real dolls.
Or real dolls.